Okay, we're going to start with section 1 of Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche says, quote, "The continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollinian and Dionysian duality, just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes, involving perpetual strife with only periodically intervening reconciliations," end quote. Okay, so understand here, this is very analogous to, there was a time, and I may have even expressed this in the past in the podcast, where I might have considered the master-slave dichotomy to be fundamentally different from the way Nietzsche talks about Apollinian and Dionysian. But a close read of just this very first introduction of the idea suggests that they're actually rather analogous, because he says this duality is like, he compares it to procreation, the duality of the sexes, and he says that's perpetual strife with periodically intervening reconciliations. So this is a true opposition. It's not quite dialectical, what he's establishing here, these two forces, which he hasn't yet defined. But he's saying this is truly two things that are opposed, and yet through their interaction, they drive art forward. In the same way that our morality today, that we inherit from both the master and slave morality, we might say the art that we inherit today, that all art pushing forward comes from the interaction of these two mutually exclusive forces that are at war with one another. And so what are these forces? Nietzsche says, quote, "The terms Dionysian and Apollinian we borrow from the Greeks, who disclosed to the discerning mind the powerful mysteries of their view of art, not to be sure in concepts, but in the intensely clear figures of their gods. Through Apollo and Dionysus, the two art deities of the Greeks, we come to recognize that in the Greek world there existed a tremendous opposition in origin and aims between the Apollinian art of sculpture and the non-imagistic Dionysian art of music. These two different tendencies run parallel to each other, for the most part openly at variance, and they continually incite each other to new and more powerful births, which perpetuate an antagonism only superficially reconciled by the common term art, until eventually, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, they appear coupled with each other, and through this coupling ultimately generate an equally Dionysian and Apollinian form of art, Attic tragedy," end quote. So in this first paragraph, we have Nietzsche's explanation, in perhaps very broad terms that we don't fully have defined yet, as to where tragedy comes from. What is the birth of tragedy? Well, it is born from the Dionysian and Apollinian, and the association we get in this first passage is the Apollinian art of sculpture. So that's imagistic. You have an image that is created in sculpture. And he says the non-imagistic Dionysian art of music. And so, roughly speaking, we have Apollo correlated with the visual arts and Dionysus with auditory arts. So Dionysus is music, and music is in its purest form, right? I mean, music might have lyrics that might conjure to mind an image, but if you're just plucking tones or playing the flute or just humming or singing a melody without any words, there's no image involved at all. And it's interesting because he says they're only superficially reconciled by the common term art. And that's a very interesting thing to think about, that I hadn't ever thought about this question before I approached this book, that visual arts, such as a sculpture, or we might in modern times consider a painting, that is art just as much as a song is art. But when we think about the differences between them, they have almost nothing in common. Or I'm trying to find the words for this here. It's like imagistic art doesn't have a temporal aspect, right? You just have a scene depicted, say on a painting, the Mona Lisa. You just have the Mona Lisa always has her Mona Lisa smile, right? She has her Mona Lisa smile no matter what time you view the painting at, no matter what day you go visit the Louvre, no matter, what angle, she's always doing the same thing. It's a moment frozen in time. It's a figure frozen in time. And that would be the same with sculpture. You have the image of a human form or a god or deity or whatever you might be sculpting. Whereas with music, and especially, it's a little different now that we have sound recording technology, but let's transport our minds to Nietzsche's time and to the time of the Greeks, for that matter. if somebody performs a song, that is a temporal event. They proceed through a series of tones, the order of which and the relationship between the tones. I mean, an individual tone, an individual note does not carry any emotional meaning. It is only through the relationship between the tones that you get things like chords, and it's the relationship between the tones in time that you get an interval, that you get a sense of whether you're hearing something which is minor and therefore a little sad, or major and might be a little more uplifting. You're playing the same notes in A minor or C major. Those are relative keys, so it's the exact same 7 notes that are in those keys, but the order in which you play them and the relationship between the tones is what gives you the art, the emotional resonance of what you're hearing, right? So music is necessarily a temporal event. It's something which you have to experience in time and which comes and then goes. And it doesn't have any physical form. It doesn't have any visual form. And so in these two different realms of the senses, art means a very different thing. It's a very different, it's almost belies the imagination to try and come up with an explanation as to how both of these things could be confounded under the label of art. And that's just talking about the medium, right? And so Nietzsche says, of course, this was not thought of in concepts in the time of the ancient Greeks. This was embodied in deities. And he says these are the two main art deities, is Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo associated with sculpture, Dionysus with music. And that through this union of the visual and auditory arts, we might say the fixed and imagistic productions that sort of are static and frozen in time versus the temporal, non-imagistic art that somehow combines together to give us tragedy. So we're still very far from drawing out a lot of what Nietzsche's talking about here, but he gives us some very helpful analogies as we continue in this next paragraph. He says, in order to grasp these two tendencies, I'm quoting here, he says, quote, "Let us first conceive of them as the separate art worlds of dreams and intoxication." End quote. And so, or I'll quote him further. He says, "These physiological phenomena present a contrast analogous to that existing between the Apollinian and the Dionysian." End quote. So we may notice dreams and intoxication. These are two separate states of mind, we might call them broadly, that have basically nothing to do with one another, right? Just the way that a sculpture and a song have nothing to do with one another. And so this can sort of help us. It's not just because these gods are the gods of, like that Apollo is the god of dreams, that Nietzsche is using Apollo. It's not simply that he's saying Apollo is the god of dreams, so I'll associate him with dreams. It is also that the dream, in Nietzsche's view, is something which we all can have an experience of, which provides us a direct encounter with what the Apollinian is. Not precisely what it is, but an analogy of what it is and how the Greeks would have understood it and why they invoked the concept of dreams in order to talk about the visual arts, right? Likewise with intoxication. That's something that you can experience yourself, and that with that direct experience, which he references the very first sentence, which I glossed over, he says at the very beginning, "We shall have gained much for aesthetics once we perceive not merely by logical inference, but with the immediate certainty of vision, that the continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollonian and Dionysian duality." And so that immediate certainty of vision can be obtained by yourself experiencing dreams and experiencing intoxication and understanding that those two states of mind correspond to what the Greeks would deify into a god, which is, in Nietzsche's understanding, how these gods are created. They are created out of these strong, resonant emotional experiences in mankind, things that seem to come from within, feelings, passions, or encounters with powerful things in nature, or having powerful experiences which we feel are auspicious or are terrifying, We deify all these things. Anything that can move us, that seems to take power over us, whether it comes from within or from without, is deified in the ancient world. And because of our pattern-seeking brains, we apply the pattern of all of these separate powers from ourselves that can move us or motivate us, or that inspire us with fear or terror or reverence. All of these things are attributed a personality and intentionality, conscious intentions. And so this is Nietzsche's explanation for why Apollo and Dionysus are the central art deities, and why they're correlated with dreams and intoxication, is that you, through your direct experience of dreaming or being intoxicated, can know the state of mind that the Greek was referring to, that he was deifying. And somehow, in a way we haven't quite teased out yet, that Apollinian force, that power of dreams, is what gives rise to the visual arts in Nietzsche's estimation. And intoxication, which does mean literal intoxication, but we might also find something like intoxication separate from having to imbibe a substance. It certainly involves that in the Dionysian rituals, but it also losing yourself, forgetting yourself in revelry and dance, right? That the whole total experience of self-forgetting is included in intoxication. So let's go on to more of what Nietzsche says. He says, so these are physiological phenomena, right? That's very important for Nietzsche, even at this early date. Physiological phenomena of dreams and the physiological phenomena of intoxication, which we can even measure these things, right, within the human body. Okay, so Nietzsche says, quote, "It was in dreams, says Lucretius, that the glorious divine figures first appeared to the souls of men. In dreams, the great shaper beheld the splendid bodies of superhuman beings, and the Hellenic poet, if questioned about the mysteries of poetic inspiration, would likewise have suggested dreams, and he might have given an explanation like that of Hans Sachs in the Meistersinger." And so Nietzsche quotes from the Meistersinger here, quote, "The poet's task is this, my friend, to read his dreams and comprehend. The truest human fancy seems to be revealed to us in dreams. All poems and versification are but true dreams' interpretation." End quote. So he's quoting Wagner there in this text addressed to Wagner. And so not much commentary to offer here, except that he says the glorious divine figures first appeared to the souls of men in dreams. Nietzsche seems fixated on the dreams thing in Human All Too Human as well, and in a couple texts after this, where he seems to think it's a theme he returns to time and again, that in their dreams, as an accident of the fact that human beings, if you've ever looked into this, it's kind of interesting. Not every animal goes into such a deep sleep that human beings go into, where both of our hemispheres of the brain completely go into unconsciousness, and we go into like rapid eye movement sleep and have these dream experiences. That basically being able to have that level of rest where we go into, because like a lot of animals, I think one hemisphere is still active. It's like you're literally sleeping with one eye open, kind of. And that makes sense evolutionarily when you think about the evolutionary arms race of nature, and everything's eating everything, and it's an abattoir and a war of all against all. So, where would you find room to completely shut down and really just relax and go completely to sleep? And you think about, well, you could only really have that with the suite of advantages that the human animals gained, where we found shelter in caves or up in trees as arboreal creatures, and we have these tribal groups where we can have some people keep watch while others sleep, and just through this combination of factors, we gain the ability to completely shut down into unconsciousness. But it seems as an accident of that, or as a necessity in order to do that, we have this dreaming thing that we do. And in dreams, Nietzsche, he more talks about this, I think, in Human All Too Human. We first gain our idea of like the immortality of the soul, or life after death, or the supernatural, insofar as like you meet dead people in dreams, that you then wake up and you realize like, oh, I talked to my grandfather and he's been dead for a long time. And so Nietzsche just sort of notes how the endless possibilities that are, I guess, our imagination is let loose to play about in dreams led us on to think about things like, we encountered strange entities and personifications of strange powers or threats, and we met the dead, and just how the human mind was expanded and led into these religious ideas and religious images through the accident of the fact that we dream. And so, just to put this into perspective of Nietzsche's broader project, it's another area where he is giving us a naturalistic or a materialistic explanation for the origin of religious beliefs, of human beliefs and ideas, right? And so we'll continue where he's talking about, he says in the dream world, every man is an artist, and he calls it the prerequisite of all plastic art. The plastic art, of course, plastic arts referring to, sculpting, any sort of art where you're working with physical materials and shaping them, right? And then Nietzsche goes on to say, quote, "In our dreams, we delight in the immediate understanding of figures. All forms speak to us. There is nothing unimportant or superfluous. But even when this dream reality is most intense, we still have, glimmering through it, the sensation that it is mere appearance. At least this is my experience. And for its frequency, indeed normality, I could deduce many proofs, including the sayings of poets," end quote. And so that's a very fun source of evidence for Nietzsche on his claims about dreams. He says, I have many sayings of poets that you could look at. I think that's perfectly well justified. I can see why the philology department probably wouldn't like it. But we could say that, the poet is somebody who's very much in touch with his dreams in Nietzsche's view. What he draws upon to do his poetry is something that fires in the, sparks that flame up in the unconscious realm of his emotions and his whole unconscious world, and that's the world of dreams. But it's interesting, Nietzsche says, we still have, the idea that this is just a mere appearance when we're dreaming. And he says that's his experience. I would say I've had that experience too. There's certainly some dreams I've had where I'm terrified, or I've I've had many post-apocalyptic dreams in my life, or when I was a kid getting chased by a monster or whatever. But I remember there was a dream I had quite recently, actually, where I was standing on the side of a cliff. I was trying to get away from something, and I had the realization that I was dreaming, and I could just sort of leap off the cliff if I wanted to, and it would be fine, right? And I sort of went into lucidity for a little bit. And I found that's it is a little common for me as well, just like Nietzsche says, where there does, when I reflect upon it, in the back of my mind when I'm dreaming, there is sort of an awareness of this doesn't seem to be real. Maybe that's just with the retrospective vision of being awake and reflecting on what happened in the dreams. Maybe it seemed more real at the time. But we have to hone in on that mere appearance thing, right? Because the phenomena-noumena distinction is going to become very important, especially in the early chapters of Birth of Tragedy. And I believe I brought it up last time when we were talking about the preface and kind of glossed over it because I was like, you need to have a background knowledge of this. And I mean, you do. I don't want to spend too much time on it here, but when he's talking about mere appearance, he's talking about the world of phenomena, and Nietzsche is coming from a decidedly post-Kantian or neo-Kantian framework where he does not have any expectation that the world of the senses is a quote-unquote objective reality or the true world. And yet he still holds to the view that there is some sort of true world or objective reality. It's just sort of beyond our senses. And we'll get into what Nietzsche thinks that is, because that's very much colored by Schopenhauer, and that becomes very clear as we move on. But Nietzsche basically thinks that everything we experience at this point in time it's not illusory, but it's mere appearance. The interesting thing here is that historically, philosophers such as Schopenhauer have always wanted to get over that, right? They want to be able to make ontological claims. They're not comfortable with reality as we know it being a sort of illusion or simply an appearance of which we can say nothing more than that it appears, right? That's sort of the best way to summarize Nietzsche's position, is that post-Kant, he's saying, the world of the senses, we can say nothing more about it than that it appears to us. Whether our sensations of the world, our visual sensations, our auditory sensations, our sensations of touch and feeling and smell and taste, we have no idea what this corresponds to outside of our senses. We can't make any claims about that. All we know is that it is in appearance. And so Nietzsche, he's following Schopenhauer there, who is also following in the tradition of Kant. Nietzsche is also very familiar with Kant. And he talks about this in the opening preface of the book, that later this is one of the things he regretted. He was still thinking in this mindset. But we cannot understand the text unless we understand that is Nietzsche's mindset at this time. But where he's perhaps different from these people like Schopenhauer, even as he uses Schopenhauerian formulations, as he says in the preface, his own ideas were so individual and singular, and we already see a hint of it here, that Nietzsche, he wants to affirm appearance. He wants to, it's not a strike against the world that it is a world of mere appearances to Nietzsche. I think that is his instinct and his inclination even at this time. It's just he hasn't abolished the idea of the true world yet. And so this perhaps clarifies what he goes on to talk about next. He says, quote, "Philosophical men even have a presentiment that the reality in which we live and have our being is also mere appearance, and that another quite different reality lies beneath it. Schopenhauer actually indicates as the criterion of philosophical activity the occasional ability to view men and things as mere phantoms or dream images," end quote. And so Nietzsche is sort of, I think, taking the next logical step from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thinks that the world we live in is will, which is the fundamental ontological character of the world, but it's also, in appearance, it is our representations. Our mind makes these representations of the various things of the world. Our senses represent the world to us, and our mind applies the principles of sufficient reason such that we construct this whole world that exists in our minds. The actual world as it exists independent of the human mind is just pure will. We can't even really conceive of that. But the world in which we live is just representation. All of these, the sense objects we experience, they're just our representations. And thus, Schopenhauer, he thinks that in aesthetics, in the arts, when we see something like a Dutch landscape painting, it renders the world to us such that we can enjoy the representation of it, we can experience the sublime beauty of the world, but the painting itself isn't an object of our willing. And willing for Schopenhauer is ultimately painful. That the ultimate nature of reality for Schopenhauer is pain and suffering, because the will is always hungry but never satisfied. We always chase after our desires, but we always are seized on by new desires, even as we fulfill them. Or we suffer out of want and privation when we don't get our desires. And so that's the true nature of reality, is that willing. And in the arts, Schopenhauer sort of sees this redemption from willing through aesthetics, through aesthetic contemplation, because it's a representation. But unlike all the other representations out in the world, when you see a bowl of fruit in a still life painting, if you're hungry, you don't think that the fruit in the still life painting will satisfy you. So you can therefore look at the form of the fruit and its colors and shape and contemplate it will-lessly, in a sense. And that this rapture from constant willing, being able to become a subject of will-less contemplation, that to Schopenhauer is the point of art. This is going to become very relevant as we keep going. But so that's why Schopenhauer would indicate that the criterion of philosophical ability. It's the occasional ability to view men and things as mere phantoms or dream images. Because that's what Schopenhauer would say a wise man would begin to do. He would begin to regard the world as simply phantasms and dream images. The wiser he is, the more he's able to detach from the objects of his desire and sort of see everything as just sort of various manifestations and illusions. And so Nietzsche says that the aesthetically sensitive man stands in the same relation to the reality of dreams as the philosopher does to the reality of existence. He is a close and willing observer, for these images afford him an interpretation of life, and by reflecting on these processes, he trains himself for life. So, fairly self-explanatory, the aesthetically sensitive man, so the person who is able to look upon works of art and get that sense of sublime beauty from them. He stands in the same relation to the reality of dreams as the philosopher does to the reality of existence. So just as the philosopher, in this Schopenhauer's estimation, is able to understand individual people and things, and this isn't just Kant, and it isn't just Buddhism. Schopenhauer's also getting this from Plato, because Plato, in his theory of the form, sees the form as the most fundamental thing. That is the real thing, is the form, and everything else is simply an approximation or an imitation of the form, which is itself immaterial and abstract and not itself any one of its individual manifestations, right? And so the philosopher, in Schopenhauer's view, following in the tradition of Plato, can look at all these individual manifestations of the will, which are all the things of existence, including even other people, as simply, they're like illusions because they are not themselves the form. So we should, in that way, look upon dreams, Nietzsche says, if we're aesthetically sensitive, or that's what the aesthetically sensitive man will do, is he'll look on dreams in the same way as just such a will-less subject of knowing. And these images afford him an interpretation of life, while Nietzsche's assertion underlying all of this is that while you're dreaming, that it is the normal experience to be at least somewhat aware that it is just a dream and not real, and thus not really the object, that the objects and people you encounter in your dreams are not really the appropriate objects of your will, right? That, in your dreams you have, therefore, an underlying intuition or instinct that nothing can really hurt you, nothing that happens really matters, or rather that, maybe that's a bad way to put it. As he says in the dream, there's nothing unimportant or superfluous. Everything strikes us as significant, but the fundamental unreality of it that we have the intuition of, undercuts any of the stress and strain and suffering of willing that we normally have. And, okay, so what else does he say? And then it's not only agreeable and friendly images that we experience in dreams. He also what is common to experience in dreams, actually, very, very common, is negative situations, threatening, dangerous situations. Not necessarily nightmares, but oftentimes in dreams we do have stressful or dire situations we find. How is it necessarily a nightmare if you have a dream where you're back in school and there's a test you didn't study for? It's not really the same thing as having a nightmare about a monster chasing you, right? It's not. You can have really horrific, gruesome nightmares, but I believe when they've done studies, the majority of dreams are negative, even when they're not nightmares. It's not overwhelming, but it's 60% of dreams are stressful, or in some way something bad is happening to you, or something out of the ordinary, or something wrong is happening. And there's a lot of speculation that this may have to do, that what's going on when we're dreaming is that your brain is sort of crunching a bunch of different scenarios that can happen to you and playing them out. And it's just sort of throwing everything at the wall. That's why dreams sometimes seem random, or, things and people and settings are all mixed up, or things are where they shouldn't be, or dead people are still alive, right? Your brain is just sort of running every what-if scenario and every combination when you're sleeping, and that this is a form of sort of practice of how would I deal with this situation in waking life. And so that's why a lot of dreams are going to be negative, because it's in this interpretation of what dreaming is, it's like a problem-solving mechanism of the brain. So anyway, back to the text. Nietzsche says that, dreams can involve, quote, the serious, the troubled, the sad, the gloomy, sudden restraints, the tricks of accident, anxious expectations, in short, the whole divine comedy of life, including the inferno, also pass before him, not like mere shadows on the wall, for he lives and suffers with these scenes, and yet not without the fleeting sensation of illusion. And perhaps many will, like myself, recall how amid the dangers and terrors of dreams, they have occasionally said to themselves, in self-encouragement and not without success, "It is a dream, I will dream on." I have likewise heard of people who were able to continue one and the same dream for 3 and even more successive nights. End quote. Okay. Well, I guess I shouldn't wrap up until the end of the paragraph, because Nietzsche says, quote, our common, what does he say? He says, we experience dreams with profound delight and a joyous necessity, basically. That's what he construes all of this as evidence of. All of these experiences and phenomena pass before us, and yet you can still say, this is a dream, I will dream on. As I've just said myself, I've had this experience as well. And so this is Apollo, and Nietzsche explains this in the next paragraph. He says, quote, the joyous necessity of the dream experience has been embodied by the Greeks in their Apollo. Apollo, the god of all plastic energies, is at the same time the soothsaying god. He who, as the etymology of the name indicates, is the shining one, the deity of light. He is also the ruler over the beautiful illusion of the inner world of fantasy. The higher truth, the perfection of these states in contrast to the incompletely intelligible everyday world, this deep consciousness of nature, healing and helping in sleep and dreams, is at the same time the symbolical analog of the soothsaying faculty and of the arts generally, which makes life possible and worth living. We must also include in our image of Apollo that delicate boundary which the dream image must not overstep, lest it have a pathological effect, in which case mere appearance would deceive us as if it were crude reality. We must keep in mind that measured restraint, that freedom from the wilder emotions, that calm of the sculptor God. His eye must be sun-like, as befits his origin. Even when it is angry and distempered, it is still hollowed by beautiful illusion. And so in one case, we might apply to Apollo the words of Schopenhauer when he speaks of the man wrapped in the veil of Maya. And he quotes Schopenhauer here, who says, just as in a stormy sea that, unbounded in all directions, raises and drops mountainous waves, howling, a sailor sits in a boat and trusts in his frail bark. So in the midst of a world of torments, the individual human being sits quietly, supported by and trusting in the principium individuationis. And that's the end of his quoting Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche wraps up the paragraph by saying, in fact, we might say of Apollo that in him the unshaken faith in this principium and the calm repose of the man wrapped up in it receive their most sublime expression. And we might call Apollo himself the glorious divine image of the principium individuationis, through whose gestures and eyes all the joy and wisdom of illusion, together with its beauty, speak to us. End quote. Okay, so we have our definition of Apollo. So Nietzsche is asking us first to think of our direct personal experience with dreams and what our experience of dreams is. Now, I know some of the claims he makes might actually not be universal, and you might have a totally different experience. That's fine. But let's just look at the case Nietzsche makes, whether you think it's true or not. And he is basically saying that the experience we have of dreaming is that we see all of these combinations of images and gods and dead people and monsters and, chimerae. What is the plural of chimeras, right? Chimerae. And we have all these sad and gloomy experiences and anxious expectations and the whole divine comedy of life, including the inferno, right? So including nightmares and horrible things. But we're able to say to ourselves, this is a dream, I'll keep on dreaming. That we can maintain that calm, restrained, sun-like eye of Apollo within the midst of our dreams. We can remind ourselves that it is only mere appearance, and steady ourselves and not quite feel the same stress and striving and willing that we experience in ordinary life, what he calls crude reality, because we're understanding the dream as simply a mere appearance. This is Apollo. He is the shining one because he's a deity of light and the ruler over the beautiful illusion of the inner world of fantasy. And so what's very interesting here in casting Apollo as the god of individuation, right? Because he says clearly at the end, he correlates him with the principle of individuation, the principium individuationist. So, the principle of individuation, what does that mean? Apollo is the faculty or the state of mind or the artistic impulse which leads us on to craft an image of ourselves as individuals and draw a boundary around individual phenomenon. And this is an illusion. So right from the very beginning, even though this is light and illumination, it's also illusion. It's fantasy. It's analogous to dreams, something which is unreal, a mere appearance, right? So this is very profound what Nietzsche's doing here. He's making the individual, the self, which is not just referring to you, but also all of the phenomena, all of the things of the world are the divisions that we draw between them are in some sense fictitious and illusory. They are artistic. Now, he hasn't defended this claim yet, but this is the nature of what he's claiming, and this is, I think, completely commensurate with what Nietzsche says throughout his entire career. And it first has a voice. He first gives it expression here in this little theory of Apollo as one of the two main art gods of ancient Greece, that individuation is not, like someone like Socrates might correlate individuation, the creation of yourself, with something like following reason in order to pursue the good and become virtuous. That's how you individuate and create a self and an identity, right? So in that view, it's not an illusion. Reason is what banishes illusion and falsehoods and destroys them. The light of reason comes in and destroys falsehood. For Apollo, no. It's completely understood that this is a matter of appearance. And when Nietzsche makes this crystal clear when he makes the comparison to Schopenhauer's passage in World as Will and Representation, when he talks about the man wrapped in the veil of Maya. The veil of Maya is illusion in Sanskrit. That is the illusion that governs the world in which we all live. That in truth, in Hinduism, the truth, according to Hindus, or the Vedantists speak more specifically, who Schopenhauer is really influenced by, reality is an undivided whole. It's a monism. Everything is Brahman. Everything. You, the table that I'm resting my arm on, that's Brahman. The microphone that I'm talking into is Brahman. This book that's bound with pages entitled Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche that I have in front of me is Brahman. It's all an undivided whole. All the separation between it is created by your mind, and it's an illusion. It's false. It's a mistake you're making in some sense. Well, we could look at it from that angle. And so when he describes the individual as this lone sailor in a boat that's being thrown on these sort of like the mountainous waves of the dynamic true nature of reality, which is, this violent, harsh, stormy sea, right? This chaos, in Schopenhauer's view, the will, right? The primordial will of which we are all a manifestation. The individual, through this power of art, through illusion, creates, sections off himself and sits upon the waves of this tumultuous sea and says, this is a dream, I shall go on dreaming, right? So it's not, this is a dream, therefore I need to wake up. It is this sort of individuation is conceived of as this this affirmative creative process of, that is necessarily artistic and therefore not rooted in reason and not based on any rational principle or any quote-unquote objective truth. It is a creation of the mind which is discovered, this power to create the individual, to create individual phenomena and name and designate them, right? And so, again, like we might correlate Apollo with the Logos, but Logos is very different because this is perceived in the Christian tradition, for example, as being the truth, whereas the Apollinian has nothing to do with your quote-unquote truth. Okay, so I've talked enough about that. So Nietzsche goes on in the next paragraph. He says, in the same work, Schopenhauer has depicted for us the tremendous terror which seizes man when he is suddenly dumbfounded by the cognitive form of phenomena because the principle of sufficient reason in some one of its manifestations seems to suffer an exception. If we add to this terror the blissful ecstasy that wells from the innermost depths of man, indeed of nature, at this collapse of the principium individuationis, we steal a glimpse into the nature of the Dionysian, which is brought home to us most intimately by the analogy of intoxication. End quote. Okay, so the principle of sufficient reason, that involves things like causality of one object being able to affect another object. It would really get us into the weeds to start talking about Schopenhauer's principle of sufficient reason. But suffice to say, all of the laws or patterns by which the various representations relate to each other and affect one another are, in Schopenhauer's view, just projections of our minds in some sense. And they're sort of like rationally demanded, right? Like for Schopenhauer, he's like, time isn't an objective reality, but insofar as our minds have to manifest all these different objects or representations in the world and interact with one another, in order for it to be even like rigorously imaginable for two objects to interact with one another, we would have to have some conception first of time and space, that these are two separate objects in space that could be in a separate state and then come to interact with each other at a later point in time. Like, he basically demonstrates how these are all sort of like logically necessitated by the act of representing the world. That's why it's like a principle of sufficient reason to have all of these like, patterns and laws for how the world works, but that those are not objective realities, that they don't belong to the ontological reality of the will. It's only belongs to the representative reality of our minds. And so what the second half of the paragraph Nietzsche talks about, the blissful ecstasy that wells up from the innermost depths of man, which is mingled with a sort of terror, as he says, at the collapse of the principium individuationis. And that is correlated with the Dionysian. And so when the individual, when that illusion that I am an individual that is separate from this tumultuous sea of the rest of reality, and my mind has created all these individual objects which are separate and distinct, behaving according to the principle of sufficient reason, when that collapses and we experience once again this primordial reality that the illusory power of the Apollinian dream has sort of separated us from, we have this terror, but also blissful ecstasy, sort of this contradictory rush of excessive feeling, and that is the Dionysian. And he says, we know that directly, not by dreams, but by intoxication. And so, after this, Nietzsche says, quote, either under the influence of the narcotic draught of which the songs of all primitive men and people speak, or with the potent coming of spring that penetrates all nature with joy, these Dionysian emotions awake, and they grow in intensity. Everything subjective, and as they grow in intensity, everything subjective vanishes into complete self-forgetfulness. In the German Middle Ages, too, singing and dancing crowds, ever increasing in number, whirled themselves from place to place under this Dionysian impulse. In these dancers of St. John and St. Vitus, we rediscover the Bacchic choruses of the Greeks, with their prehistory in Asia Minor as far back as Babylon and the orgiastic Sakaea. There are some who, from obtuseness or lack of experience, turn away from such phenomena as from folk diseases, with contempt or pity born of the consciousness of their own healthy-mindedness. But of course, such poor wretches have no idea how corpse-like and ghostly their so-called healthy-mindedness looks when the glowing life of the Dionysian revelers roars past them." End quote. So what Nietzsche's referring to here were a series of very unusual incidents in the Middle Ages, which I believe started around the 1100s, I want to say, and went till like the 1400s. I could be wrong. I think there were a few scattered incidents that happened, like centuries apart, even after that. But the last, like, St. Vitus incident happened many, many centuries ago. And basically what this was a dancing sickness that in certain towns and villages, and various hypotheses have been proposed to explain this, people just started dancing. Multiple people. And it was not everyone in the town. It was like some selection, seemingly randomly, of people in the town just started dancing uncontrollably. Like they couldn't stop. And then sometimes they would eventually tire out, but then they'd get up the next day and they'd start dancing again. And it didn't seem to be subject to their will. It didn't seem to be a conscious decision. And sometimes people literally couldn't stop, and they destroyed their bodies. They just danced until they died. They didn't take any rest. They couldn't eat or drink, and they just eventually collapsed of exhaustion and died. Sometimes towns would get together bands and play music and have a whole dancing fest where people who were not afflicted with the sickness would join in as a way to, like, I think their reasoning was like, let's just get it out of their system. Let's help them get it out. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. And the thing is, any one explanation for this seems to belie, like, it's very difficult to say, like, well, maybe they, maybe there was some ergot in the wheat they were eating that made them hallucinate, or, maybe there was something in the water, right? The blah, blah, blah. There's all these explanations like this. I think Nietzsche is drawing on it as an example of the Dionysian, of saying, no, this is actually speaking to some ancient impulse that's uncontrollable, that just wells up and erupts out of people. And it's ancient, and it still exists in mankind today. And the thing is, the reason why these sort of ideas, like maybe it was just something in the water, don't work for me, at least, is because these incidents were hundreds of years apart, in some cases, often decades apart, in towns miles apart, all over Europe, Western Europe. And I don't think it's the case that people could have heard about this in many cases, like with the way communication was, where, you have like a random village on one side of France where everyone just starts dancing randomly. And then 20 years later, on the complete other side of Germany, it happens in some town there. It's like, what is going on there exactly? And no one knows. And so what the people thought at the time was, they called it the curse of St. Vitus. Or St. John, but St. Vitus is far more popular. Just as a bit of trivia, there's obviously Black Sabbath had the song St. Vitus's Dance, and from that name, the band St. Vitus, one of the early doom bands, took their name. And I think independently of that, there's a bar in Brooklyn actually called the St. Vitus Bar, which all references to this concept. And that's like a rather famous bar in Brooklyn. Played there. Also played with St. Vitus, the band. But so that's just me bragging. But and when he references the Bacchic choruses of the Greeks with their prehistory in Asia Minor as far back as Babylon and the orgiastic Sacaea, these were all cities, states, or previous civilizations that also had revelrous, orgiastic dance rituals, basically. And so, very interesting. So, next paragraph, Nietzsche says, quote, "Under the charm of the Dionysian, not only is the union between man and man reaffirmed, but nature, which has become alienated, hostile, or subjugated, celebrates once more her reconciliation with her lost son, man." End quote. So, man is unified together. No longer are we separate individuals, but in this ritual, we once again feel that we've come together. We're in a sort of communion together. And, it's not just between man and man, it's that man feels that he can become one with nature again. And so then he gives us sort of an image of Dionysus as he's covered with flowers and garlands, and panthers and tigers walk under his yoke. And further down in the paragraph, he says, quote, "Now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid, hostile barriers that necessity, caprice, or impudent convention have fixed between man and man are broken." What do we see? Oh, okay. He says, "Each one feels himself not only united, reconciled, and fused with his neighbor, but as one with him, as if the veil of Maya had been torn aside and were now merely fluttering in tatters before the mysterious primordial unity." End quote. So it's all rather self-explanatory, but again, Apollo creates these boundaries. That's what it is to individuate. So that's perhaps one of the great insights here. To individuate, to set some, break down the word. Individual cannot be divided into two. That's what individual means. Cannot be divided into two. It is something which you can't break up into smaller pieces, that it's, we might say with a human being, whether or not this is true, I know the Buddhists would certainly dispute this, it's a person, their personality, their subjectivity is an emergent phenomenon that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so even though you could break down a person into all these different parts, like their memory and their physical form and all these things, that there is a person there that it can't be divided into, that has like a core or essence. I would say that that's what a lot of people still believe. And Nietzsche certainly doesn't believe that, but he does see in Apollo the power to create that as a fiction, as an illusion, that's what Apollo gives us, that it's through art, and an art that we learned through the power of dreaming, that we are able to create ourselves. But the Dionysian rituals, wherever they happened, which were rituals of drunkenness and dancing, represented the dissolution of that individuality. And that means tearing down the borders and boundaries. And so we can already see a sort of connection here, which we'll sort of tease out as we go on, how it's similar and how it's different, between like the Rousseauian vision of nature and Dionysus, the romantic Rousseauian and Dionysus. And here, at this point in the text, it's not obvious the ways that they are different, because it's sort of what Rousseau talks about, and we'll talk about this when we get into politics next season. That's his whole political project, is that, the first time, when boundary stones were erected on different plots of land and all the boundaries went up, and man said, this stretch of earth is mine and no one else's, that's when, injustice and misery came into the world. And by uprooting those boundary stones, by destroying those boundaries and differences between people, the differences between slave and free man, between master and servant, we eliminate all that when we go back to nature, which has none of these fictitious divisions between people. And so Dionysus, I think at this point in the text, we can say, corresponds to that to some extent, to this rapture into the primal unity of nature. Okay, so Nietzsche says, in song and dance, man expresses himself as a member of a higher community. He's forgotten how to walk and speak and is on the way toward flying into the air, dancing. So again, these are certainly ways that Nietzsche would look upon something in a praiseworthy manner. Dancing in such a way that it seems like you're about to take off and fly into the air. That's classic Nietzsche, like ecstatic prose, right? But a little further down in the paragraph, we get something very important, where Nietzsche says, quote, "He is no longer an artist, he has become a work of art. In these paroxysms of intoxication, the artistic power of all nature reveals itself to the highest gratification of the primordial unity. The noblest clay, the most costly marble, man, is here kneaded and cut, and to the sound of the chisel strokes of the Dionysian world artist rings out the cry of the Eleusinian mysteries." Do you prostrate yourselves, millions? Do you sense your maker, world? End quote. So that's the end of section 1. And basically we have our clear definitions, as clear as they can be, since they're not concepts, right? They're deities, of Apollo and Dionysus. And notice Apollo is sort of embodying what it means to be the artist who is able to stand aside from his art, to say, this is a dream, I will go on dreaming, to have that sort of separation. Apollo is very influenced by Schopenhauer and his view on the visual arts. It's not exactly analogous to what Schopenhauer says, and we'll get into that more as we go on, but the correlation is very clear. And so there's that element of being able to be a little bit disinterested or dispassionate in one's art in the Apollinian. Whereas the Dionysian, he correlates that with you becoming the work of art. You're not the artist. When you experience the Dionysian artistic force or that sort of artistic power, you yourself are not the artist. You are the work of art. You are the clay being kneaded. You are experiencing the chisel strokes of the Dionysian. The Dionysian, this power of music, this power of the allure of nature calling you back to be self-forgetting and abandon this illusory individuality, is something which is not the product of your conscious willing. It's something that seizes hold of you and breaks you out of that illusion, whether you like it or not, in the way that the St. Vitus dancers, right, are seized and made to dance, whether they like it or not. And so under the Dionysian, you're not the artist, you're the work of art. So what a beginning, right? And so, all right, when we get into part 2, he says, we've considered the Apollinian and its opposite, the Dionysian, as artistic energies which burst forth from nature herself, without the mediation of the human artist. And so that might be strange given what I just said about Apollo, but what he means here is that the initial spark of what gives us the ability to do art in this way with Apollo is dreams. And he clarifies, first, in the image world of dreams, whose completeness is not dependent upon the intellectual attitude or the artistic culture of any single being, right? So the origin of the Apollinian art, which later would be, of course, consciously directed as you're engaging in the plastic arts or writing epic poetry or these sorts of things, right? Nietzsche would say later epic poetry becomes a form of Apollinian art. Nevertheless, the dreams are not something which you consciously created. They come out of your unconsciousness. And so too, he says, quote, intoxicated reality, which likewise does not heed the single unit, but even then seeks to destroy the individual and redeem him by a mystic feeling of oneness. He goes on to say, with reference to these immediate art states of nature, every artist is an imitator, that is to say, either an Apollinian artist in dreams or a Dionysian artist in ecstasies, or finally, as for example, in Greek tragedy, at once artist in both dreams and ecstasies. End quote. So that's another way to put it, that Nietzsche considers both of these artistic forces to come directly from nature, at least in their origin, and that intoxication, which he now switches, he substitutes the word ecstasies. When we think about it in terms of just whole communities being seized by the St. Vitus dance, this isn't something that Nietzsche thinks we have to consciously, go cultivate grains and let them ferment and make, intoxicating liquid in order to experience this. That there's a sort of natural collective insanity that perhaps we see in, you can see it even in the modern day at a Pentecostal, worship ceremony or whatever their church service is, where people are speaking in tongues and rolling around on the floor and stuff like that, right? This sort of spontaneous group annihilation of the individual in favor of this sort of ecstatic collective experience. And, there's also been a lot of research recently about, the behavior of crowds, and, like you can see it happen at like big music festivals, and I don't know. So it doesn't actually require an intoxicant. You can be intoxicated by just the power of the group breaking down all these individual boundaries and giving way to ecstasy. And Nietzsche thinks that's a natural thing that happens in, I guess, human social groups. And just as dreams is a natural thing for us to experience individually in our minds as we sleep unconsciously. But both of them come from unconscious nature. And so that's the justification where he says each artist is basically just an imitator of either this, the mind's illusory creation of this individuated image, or ecstatic rapture, intoxication, breaking down of boundaries. And once again, he hints that the two of them, in his theory, came together to produce Greek tragedy. That dramatic tragedy in the Greek form is the expression of both. And so, let's see. Next paragraph down, he says, quote, "So much for these general premises and contrasts. Let us now approach the Greeks in order to learn how highly these art impulses of nature developed in them." A little further down, he says, "In spite of all the dream literature and the numerous dream anecdotes of the Greeks, we can speak of their dreams only conjecturally, though with reasonable assurance. If we consider the incredibly precise and unerring plastic power of their eyes, together with their vivid, frank delight in colors, we can hardly refrain from assuming, even for their dreams, to the shame of all those born later, a certain logic of line and contour, colors and groups, a certain pictorial sequence reminding us of their finest bas-reliefs, whose perfection would certainly justify us, if a comparison were possible, in designating the dreaming Greeks as Homers, and Homer as a dreaming Greek, in a deeper sense than that in which the modern man, speaking of his dreams, ventures to compare himself with Shakespeare." End quote. And so, we might think of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, this sort of, dreamlike procession of fairy figures all frolicking around in the forest. You might compare a dream you have to that, or, just as, who is it, Mercutio talks of his strange dream of Queen Mab and Romeo and Juliet. But Nietzsche, he sort of, it's another thing that we might not really believe him on or see any justification for actually holding this view, that the Greek mind was just so, what does he say? They had a logic of line and contour and colors and groups. Like, we can look at their fine bas-reliefs and their sculptures and their art and just see how the Greek command of line and form and all of these things was so complete that their dreams just must have been amazing. They must have been like better than a blockbuster film, is I think what Nietzsche is getting at here, that, we should all, it's to the shame of all of us born later that we can't have dreams as amazingly precise and vivid as Greek dreams. But Homer here, he mentions, and Homer is Nietzsche's, he calls him, we'll get into this later, a naive artist. And what he means by that is that Homer is like he's like the first Apollinian, major Apollinian figure in his view. That he is the first link out of a chain of coming out of this direct, the primordial artist of dreams, that would be what Apollo would be experienced as to the Greek mind, right? Apollo is the soothsayer god from whom we are getting these dream images. That's the primordial artist in us, and Homer is a mere imitator of that primordial artist, but he's a naive artist because he's sort of standing at the dawn of civilization before there's all these theories of art. He has no conscious reflection on what it is that he's doing, right? He doesn't understand any of the things that we've just been talking about, that, reason and education and self-reflection has taught us to be able to isolate. Okay, so what do we see here? Oh, on the other hand, This is in the next paragraph. Nietzsche writes, quote, "We need not conjecture regarding the immense gap which separates the Dionysian Greek from the Dionysian barbarian. From all quarters of the ancient world, to say nothing here of the modern, from Rome to Babylon, we can point to the existence of Dionysian festivals, types which bear at best the same relation to the Greek festivals which the bearded satyr, who borrowed his name and attributes from the goat, bears to Dionysus himself. In nearly every case, these festivals centered in extravagant sexual licentiousness, whose waves overwhelmed all family life and its venerable traditions. The most savage natural instincts were unleashed." End quote. So Nietzsche basically says the festivals at Sakaea, which were certainly Dionysian in character, have to be distinguished from Greek Dionysian festivals, right? And I suppose his reasoning for this is that the Greek society had enough of an infusion of the Apollinian counter art force that there is, and both of which are just part of human nature, that it was able to withstand the Dionysian. And that in these other societies, in Babylon, for example, they just allowed this self-forgetting and this breaking down of all boundaries to give way to like a sexual licentiousness, and just that overwhelmed and degenerated their society. And they're as different as the bearded satyr is from Dionysus, who Dionysus is usually portrayed as a, attractive young man. He's a beautiful human form. He's not a, half man, half animal, even though like later on Bacchus would acquire horns and start to look a lot like the satyrs. And so Nietzsche thinks the Greeks were not allowed, or they did not allow the Dionysian art force to get out of control. Now, I don't know about the history or the anthropological basis of what Nietzsche is saying here. I personally don't believe, for example, that in Babylon they would allow sexual licentiousness springing from these Dionysian festivals to destroy their tradition and family structure. That just doesn't track with me with what I know about the ancient world. So maybe that's just a prejudice that Nietzsche is carrying on from the 19th century, that these the Eastern ancient city-states were all just degenerate, whereas the Greeks were better, and they were just built different. But anyway, we'll move on. So he says, quote, "For some time, however, the Greeks were apparently perfectly insulated and guarded against the feverish excitements of these festivals, though knowledge of them must have come to Greece on all the routes of land and sea. For the figure of Apollo, rising full of pride, held out the Gorgon's head to this grotesquely uncouth Dionysian power, and really could not have countered any more dangerous force. It is in Doric art that this majestically rejecting attitude of Apollo is immortalized." So Doric art, that refers to the art of the Dorians, which includes, most famously, their most prominent city-state is Sparta, the Lacedaemonians. And so Nietzsche is saying, and I think this is apt, that the Doric forms of art and their whole aesthetic is staunchly Apollinian and anti-Dionysian. We just might think of the whole rigorous, regimented, strict way of life of Sparta to understand, and we might look to Doric architecture and its regularity and the whole form and the whole content of Doric civilization was staunchly Apollinian. And I love the imagery of Apollo holding out the Gorgon's head, like Perseus, right? And so Nietzsche goes on to say that, quote, "The opposition between Apollo and Dionysus became more hazardous and even impossible when similar impulses finally burst forth from the deepest roots, of Hellenic nature, and made a path for themselves. The Delphic god, by a seasonably effected reconciliation, now contented himself with taking the destructive weapons from the hands of his powerful antagonist. This reconciliation is the most important moment in the history of the Greek cult. Wherever we turn, we note the revolutions resulting from this event. The two antagonists were reconciled, the boundary lines to be observed henceforth by each were sharply defined, and there was to be a periodical exchange of gifts of esteem. End quote. So Nietzsche is speaking of the incorporation of Dionysian rituals and festivals into ancient Greece in the context of this this people which has a previous character of being, rigorously individuating. And he treats this reconciliation between Apollo and Dionysus as if he speaks about it in the language as if we're talking about two military powers coming to a treaty, right? And striking a peace by setting clear boundaries and deciding to have an exchange of gifts. This is a very old means of effecting treaties and alliances between peoples. But Nietzsche goes on to say, quote, "At bottom, however, the chasm was not bridged over. But if we observe how, under the pressure of this treaty of peace, the Dionysian power revealed itself, we shall now recognize in the Dionysian orgies of the Greeks, as compared with the Babylonian Sakeia, with their reversion of man to the tiger and ape, the significance of festivals of world redemption and days of transfiguration. It is with them that nature for the first time attains her artistic jubilee. It is with them that the destruction of the principium individuationis for the first time becomes an artistic phenomenon." End quote. So remember, intoxication, ecstasy, one becomes the work of art. One is seized upon. One has the chisel strokes of Dionysus delivered to them, right? That breaks down all these barriers. So this is all very destructive language, and it's not the language of creativity, we might say, which you might say is like a key part of art. And so the Dionysian needs the Apollinian in order to truly become artistic. And this is sort of what Nietzsche is talking about when he is speaking specifically about ancient Greek art and ancient Greek tragedy and the Greek culture. It's very easy to make it concrete, but from the very beginning, he makes it clear that the Dionysian and the Apollinian, he thinks, are the two forces that push along and drive all art, and that we will understand something for all aesthetics, including the art that we're creating in the modern day once we understand this. That basically, at the base of all art is this interplay between individuation and dissolution. If I were to put that into abstract terms, it would be that the artist is the one who draws boundaries and erases them. And that in all of the arts, whatever different form they take, now in the modern world where there are so many different arts, it's the artist in whatever medium he's using is the one who is creative by deciding which boundaries to honor and which ones to destroy, which new boundaries he will draw, and so on and so forth, whatever that might mean, right? I mean, we might talk about the fusion of two musical genres, or we might talk about, mixing media for visual arts, right? Those are just two very basic examples, but the point is these are completely aesthetic decisions. And so in some sense, they are arbitrary and necessarily derive from the instincts or the intuitions or the taste of the artist. And the only judgment we can really have are judgments of our own tastes or inclinations, right? And so this is it's a very interesting view of art, and it's one which I think does actually elucidate something to us already in the modern world. But, okay, so to continue on, this is all just to say, the destruction of the principium individuationis, the destruction of the principle of individuation, the dissolution of it. Apollo, somewhat paradoxically, gives us the ability to create an image of what the destruction of the individual image looks like. That itself can become an image, right? Okay, so continuing. This is in the next paragraph. Quote, "At the very climax of joy, there sounds a cry of horror or a yearning lamentation for an irretrievable loss. In these Greek festivals, nature seems to reveal a sentimental trait. It is as if she were heaving a sigh at her dismemberment into individuals. The song and pantomime of such dually minded revelers was something new and unheard of in the Homeric Greek world, and the Dionysian music in particular excited awe and terror." I kind of glossed over the beginning of this paragraph, and I shouldn't have done that. So sorry, I'm going to jump backwards a little bit. But he mentions it's a curious blending and duality in the emotions of the Dionysian revelers. Quote, "As medicines remind us of deadly poisons, of the phenomenon that pain begets joy, that ecstasy may wring sounds of agony from us." So in this paragraph, with the blending of the Apollinian and Dionysian, we get a blending of, it's very odd. It's like, rather than simply experiencing emotions in all their totality, we begin to understand the relativity of these emotional states to one another. Bringing things into our understanding like this is necessarily Apollinian. I don't know. I guess we're just starting to see how in these rituals, in the context of ancient Greece, Nietzsche believes that in this interplay of individuation and dissolution, we get this new phenomenon where we can symbolically represent the Dionysian. It's very interesting. We can symbolically represent dissolution. We can individuate the concept of the destruction of the individual. And Nietzsche goes on to say, quote, "If music, as it would seem, had been known previously as an Apollinian art, it was so, strictly speaking, only as the wave beat of rhythm, whose formative power was developed for the representation of Apollonian states. The music of Apollo was Doric architectronics in tones." Skipping down a little bit, "The very element which forms the essence of Dionysian music, and hence music in general, is carefully excluded as un-Apollinian, namely the emotional power of the tone, the uniform flow of the melody, and the utterly incomparable world of harmony. In the Dionysian dithyramb, man is incited to the greatest exaltation of all his symbolic faculties. Something never before experienced struggles for utterance. The annihilation of the veil of Maya, oneness as the soul of the race and of nature itself. The essence of nature is now to be expressed symbolically. We need a new world of symbols, and the entire symbolism of the body is called into play. Not the mere symbolism of the lips, face, and speech, but the whole pantomime of dancing, forcing every member into rhythmic movement." Skipping down a little further, "To grasp this collective release of all the symbolic powers, man must have already attained that height of self-abnegation, which seeks to express itself symbolically through all these powers. And so, the dithyrambic votary of Dionysus is understood only by his peers. With what astonishment must the Apollinian Greek have beheld him? With an astonishment that was all the greater, the more it was mingled with the shuddering suspicion that all this was actually not so very alien to him after all. In fact, that it was only his Apollinian consciousness which, like a veil, hid this Dionysian world from his vision." End quote. Okay, so there we have it. The essence of nature is now to be expressed symbolically. And so what is happening is the destruction of the individual self-consciousness, the sense of being an individual separate from all others. But the other side of that, so to speak, is this direct perception of like some sort of primordial unity of man and nature. And so something never before experienced struggles for utterance. The annihilation of the veil of Maya, oneness as the soul of the race and nature itself, right? And so before the Dionysian, which Nietzsche says exists in Babylon and exists in all these ancient cities that predate the Greeks, and in his view, it overwhelmed all those civilizations because it was just too powerful. But when it meets the Greek mind, which is uniquely precise and, has this command of line and form and color and the plastic arts, and has really developed its power to shape images in accord with the dream images that he receives from Apollo. With that faculty, the Greek at the Dionysian revelry is able to render a dream image of the oneness of nature. It's something that has never before been done. And so it's sort of within this Apollinian magic circle that the Dionysian is contained. And something new comes to be expressed in symbolic form that before, it was just sort of like the orgiastic destruction of the self, and you don't get anything creative out of that. Now speaking here of like the way Nietzsche talks about the festivals of Sakea, where he says man returns to just being a tiger and an ape, right? It just returns to animal form. But with our Apollinian faculty for representation, we can actually represent the horrifying and beautiful reality of the Dionysian, and the Apollinian Greek comes to gain great respect for the Dionysian mystery cults as he comes to perceive the veil of Maya, that perhaps this mystery cult is revealing something about the true nature of the world, of which I am simply separated from it as by a veil. And so moving on to section 3, Nietzsche says, quote, "It becomes necessary to level the artistic structure of the Apollinian culture, as it were, stone by stone, till the foundations on which it rests become visible. First of all, we see the glorious Olympian figures of the gods standing on the gables of this structure. Their deeds, pictured in brilliant reliefs, adorn its friezes. We must not be misled by the fact that Apollo stands side by side with the others as an individual deity, without any claim to priority of rank, for the same impulse that embodied itself in Apollo gave birth to this entire Olympian world, and in this sense Apollo is its father. What terrific need was it that could produce such an illustrious company of Olympian beings?" End quote. So Nietzsche is saying the Apollinian culture, which is sort of the beginning of the ancient Greek culture, it springs from the Olympians, the gods on Mount Olympus. They are, these great heroes. They are these beautiful forms. They are terrifying. They can't even be beheld by mortals. They're capricious, but they're extraordinary in every way. And they're powerful. That's the most important thing. They're great and powerful. They can reward and requite mankind. And so Nietzsche sees this creation of this world of Olympian gods and heroes as like the fundamental, act of Apollinian artistry in the Greek mind. And his comment there about Apollo just appearing as one god among many, that's because even though Apollo is one of the more central deities in Greece and in Rome, typically you might say, well, obviously Zeus or Jupiter is the father of all the gods. But what Nietzsche is saying is that since it's actually in the dream image that man first expands his capacity for, capacity for representation into the supernatural, into the world of imagining things like immortality and imagining things like gods and other beings watching over us, or that he inhabits a world with all these invisible forces that can manifest on his life in this way. Nietzsche thinks the origin of that is the dream image, and since Apollo is the god of dreams, then therefore he's the father of all the gods. And so now he's going to talk about what need was it that could produce the Olympians. And so this is often the formula of how Nietzsche pursues questions. When he looks at a given phenomenon, or when he looks at a belief someone has, or a practice someone did, or a moral idea, or whatever it might be in a culture, any sort of social, psychological, moral phenomenon, he asks, well, what need did this fulfill? Why did they need to have that belief? I think it's incredibly useful. So he says, quote, "Whoever approaches these Olympians with another religion in his heart, searching among them for moral elevation, even for sanctity, for disincarnate spirituality, for charity and benevolence, will soon be forced to turn his back on them, discouraged and disappointed." End quote. So this is the silent hostility with which Nietzsche is treating Christianity, by the way. We see it very clearly here. Quote, "We hear nothing but the accents of an exuberant, triumphant life in which all things, whether good or evil, are deified." And so the spectator may stand quite bewildered before this fantastic excess of life, asking himself by virtue of what magic potion these high-spirited men could have found life so enjoyable that, wherever they turned, their eyes beheld the smile of Helen, the ideal picture of their own existence, floating in sweet sensuality. End quote. So, Nietzsche here is... he speaks in terms that remind us of how he would later write. When he's talking about accents of an exuberant, triumphant life in which all things, whether good or evil, are deified. We see how in the mythology of the ancient Greeks, in which indeed Nietzsche is correct, using good or evil simply in the way that maybe David Hume would have used them, right? That these are, we call what's good that which helps us, we call that which is evil that which hurts us, right? And that's a rather simple way of looking at things, but it doesn't really have to do with the intentionality of what's helping or hurting you. It doesn't have to do with, whether they're, respectable or admirable or not, or whether they are a good person or a bad person. It's just like, oh, you're hurting me, that's evil, right? And so very simple way of viewing the world based solely on consequence and correspondence. It completely tracks with everything I know about early man. And that is how the Greeks looked at the gods, right? Mostly they're sacrificing to them and making offerings and pacts with the gods and taking oaths to the gods to get the gods to do something for them, to protect them, and or to appease the wrath of the gods, to try and stop the gods from harming them. And so the gods could do things that were good or do things that were evil. And the offerings you make, the sacrifices you make to the gods, it's not because you think the gods are quote unquote good in a moral sense, the way we would think about it today. It's just the way you would just rationally, practically have to appease the gods if you think these are real entities that could help or harm you according to whether you sacrifice to them or not. And so this is something which is so foreign from our moral way of viewing the world now that Nietzsche is trying to basically tell us to take a step back and don't look for any of the signs that we would look for to indicate holiness according to the morality that's been drilled into us from Christianity for 2,000 years. That's, in so many words, what he's saying. But then the question he's saying, so, by virtue of what magic potion these high-spirited men could have found life so enjoyable, that their eyes beheld the smile of Helen, the ideal picture of their own existence wherever they turn. And what Nietzsche's getting at there is that the gods live lives very similar to mankind. They have desires and motivations that are very similar to mankind. But they exist in these, so they are us in many ways in the Greek way of looking at it, and yet they are the ideal, shining, beautiful examples of us that just stand so much above us, up high on Mount Olympus. And so it's a deification of things in mankind that are... I'm trying to get this across. I mean, it's very clear in Nietzsche's later work, but it's like we're seeing the origin of it here, that he's basically saying, what a wonderful excess of life. You must be so in love with human life and with humanity and all of the good and bad, the faults and the virtues of humanity, that you're willing to spiritualize all of it and make all of it divine, such that you'll say that the gods have marital disputes and plot against each other and make war and can be petty and can be hateful, and not to construe the gods as a Christian would, construe God, as like a sort of freak who, has none of the emotional motivations or reality that human beings have. And it's actually impossible to imagine an all-powerful, omnipresent, all-knowing being having the same emotional inner life that we have, when it's like this universal, all-encompassing ultra-consciousness that the Christian or any monotheistic God is. And so this point will become emphasize more as we continue. So Nietzsche goes on. So this is a really important passage. Nietzsche says, quote, and he's quoting from Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus. Quote, "There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked, what was the best and most desirable of all things for man? Fixed and immovable, the demigod said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words. O wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon." End quote. That's the end of Nietzsche quoting Sophocles. I'll include what he says next. Nietzsche comments, he says, quote, "How is the world of the Olympian gods related to this folk wisdom, even as the rapturous vision of the tortured martyr to his suffering?" End quote. Okay, so Silenus gives us a wonderful statement of like Schopenhauerian pessimism that Nietzsche finds in the ancient Greeks. It would be better if you were never born. And the second best is to die soon. Now, or maybe that's a more Chironic than it is Schopenhauerian, but you get the point. Complete pessimism about life. Life has nothing to offer. It would be better if you were never born. And when we consider that Nietzsche has sort of classified the Dionysian as tearing away the veil of Maya, so tearing down the Schopenhauerian world of representations which our mind creates and communing directly with the ontological reality, which is just the will, which is tumultuous and chaotic, right? But once we tear down those representations, we're one with it again, and therefore we no longer have all of the fears and strain and stress of life. We just we annihilate our individual self-consciousness, ego death, or whatever you want to call it, and that pain of being an individual willing being, we just get absorbed back into the primordial unity again. And so Silenus, who is a lieutenant or a companion of Dionysus, a demigod who is in part of his entourage, I guess, rightfully then is a pessimist about life, right? About activity and striving and all of the things that Apollo might urge us on to do. Because the fruits of the Dionysian revelry, the point of all the Dionysian festivals is this relief from the striving and suffering of individuated life. And so Silenus, quite fittingly, is a pessimist about life. So further down in another paragraph, Nietzsche says, quote, "It is as if the Olympian magic mountain had opened before us and revealed its roots to us. The Greek knew and felt the terror and horror of existence. That he might endure this terror at all, he had to interpose between himself and life the radiant dream birth of the Olympians. That overwhelming dismay in the face of the titanic powers of nature, the Moira enthroned inexorably over all knowledge, the vulture of that great lover of mankind, Prometheus, the terrible fate of the wise Oedipus, the family curse of the Atridae which drove Orestes to matricide. In short, that entire philosophy of the Sylvan god, with its mythical exemplars, which caused the downfall of the melancholy Etruscans, all this was again and again overcome by the Greeks with the aid of the Olympian middle world of art, or at any rate, it was veiled and withdrawn from sight. It was in order to be able to live that the Greeks had to create these gods from a most profound need. Perhaps we may picture the process to ourselves somewhat as follows. Out of the original Titanic divine order of terror, the Olympian divine order of joy gradually evolved through the Apollinian impulse toward beauty, just as roses burst forth from thorny branches. How else could this people, so sensitive, so vehement in its desires, so singularly capable of suffering, have endured existence, if it had not been revealed to them in their gods, surrounded with a higher glory. End quote. And so, Nietzsche gives us several examples from tragedy here, which are absolute horror, right? The terrible fate of the wise Oedipus, Prometheus and his vulture getting his liver ripped out every day and grows back and he just suffers horribly. The family curse of the Atridae. He says this reveals that philosophy of the Sylvan god. Sylvan referring to Silenus. Sylvan means forest. He's a forest god. Of course, Dionysus comes from the forest because it's like a reunification of man and nature. And so his demigod Silenus is a Sylvan god. And he says, again, it's another Nietzsche hypothesis that I don't really know the evidence for, or if he could have even had any evidence. Again, he says in his preface, he was disdainful of proof, so it should tell us all we need to know, but that the Etruscans were another victim of the Dionysian, just overwhelmed by it, right? Because the Dionysian, this desire, this yearning to return to the primal nature, carries with it this pessimism about life. And so I guess here is where we can see where Nietzsche departs from Rousseau. And we can already see him departing from Schopenhauer here, because that Nietzsche doesn't agree with that pessimism. We can see it in his inclinations and tastes in his writing, as he's writing here, that he admires the shining, beautiful examples of the gods of Olympus, which they elevate above themselves and such that they can entice or induce themselves to living even in the face of the awful wisdom of the Sylvan god, which they are willing to now depict in Apollinian form, right? Or through the powers, not in Apollinian form, but through the powers of the Apollinian ability to render an image, right? So we're starting to see how Greek tragedy emerges, because Greek tragedy is the wisdom of Silenus, the awful, terrible truth, the terror of reality, that divine primal order of terror, but revealed to us in such a way that we form a conscious image and it comes into our ability for conscious self-reflection. But the Olympian divine order of joy then gradually it evolves from this Apollinian impulse toward beauty as roses burst forth from thorny bushes. And he asks, how could they have endured existence without these gods? So it is that sacralization of mankind and the rendering of them into this shining ideal dream image that justifies the world. And in the following paragraph, we're going to get the most beautiful statement of this in the book, one of the most beautiful statements. Nietzsche says, quote, "The same impulse which calls art into being as the complement and consummation of existence, seducing one to a continuation of life, was also the cause of the Olympian world, which the Hellenic will made use of as a transfiguring mirror. Thus do the gods justify the life of man. They themselves live it, the only satisfactory theodicy. Existence under the bright sunshine of such gods is regarded as desirable in itself, and the real pain of Homeric men is caused by parting from it, especially by early parting, so that now, reversing the wisdom of Silenus, we might say of the Greeks that, quote, to die soon is the worst of all for them, the next worst, to die at all. Once heard, it will ring out again. Do not forget the lament of the short-lived Achilles, mourning the leaf-like change and vicissitudes of the race of men and the decline of the heroic age. It is not unworthy of the greatest hero to long for a continuation of life, even though he live as a day laborer. At the Apollinian stage of development, the will longs so vehemently for this existence, the Homeric man feels himself so completely at one with it, that lamentation itself becomes a song of praise." End quote. So, okay, first things first. The gods justify the life of man because they themselves live it, and this is the only satisfactory theodicy. A theodicy is an answer to the problem of evil. Again, evil referring here to just bad things happening. It doesn't really have to do with intentionality. And in fact, the hardest problem in the problem of evil for the theologians to deal with, because I guess I should explain for people who are completely unfamiliar with this. This is a religious argument. The problem of evil is an argument against God, and the theologians create theodicies to say, well, why evil in the world doesn't disprove God. And that's what a theodicy is. It's an argument against that idea. And the theologians, Nietzsche would say, have never produced any satisfactory theodicies or any more satisfactory than the Greek world of the Olympians. That this is what enticed the Greek to life, was the beauty and the heroism, or the beauty of the heroism of the Olympians, and the desire to become beautiful as they were, to imitate the Greek gods, to do deeds that would echo down to, through the ages of men. And this was all very possible for the Greek, by the way, because we have to remember that the ancient Greeks emerge in their most distant past ages from a religious belief that basically involved ancestor worship and the veneration of one's past generations and heroes as literal gods. And so deification, that actually happened. Human beings were worshipped as gods, people that were known to have been previously human beings. Now, maybe over the ages, this sort of becomes like a mystified process. And when you're talking about the legendary founder of your bloodline that lived 5 centuries ago, do you really have a concept that this was really a flesh and blood man who was living? Maybe not, but at the same time, there was the understanding that those who died would themselves become sort of the domestic deities of a given, family. And so this idea of these, these gods that are these superhuman, idealistic beings that reign above all of us, that stand above all mankind, that could serve as an inspiration or an enticement to life, because one might imagine in ancient Greece that they actually could do something as heroic, that they could actually become as beautiful, that they could actually become as strong and powerful and, sort of attain immortality through their deeds, or that sort of thing. So, very different conception of divinity than we have, that sort of linked man and the divine through the Olympians. And through this, we reverse the wisdom of Silenus and the pessimism that makes the Dionysian, that allows basically the Apollinian to overcome the Dionysian desire to destroy our individual self-consciousness and return to being tigers and apes, as Nietzsche says. And we remember Achilles. Achilles is encountered in the Odyssey, when they have to journey through the underworld. And of course, Achilles says, no winning words about death to me, Odysseus. I'd rather be a day laborer in a field, just to have one more day to see the sunshine and the warmth of summer and breathe the air and taste water from the fresh spring, right? It would be worth it to be a day laborer rather than a glorious hero, just to live again. And remember, that's a Homeric play. So Homer is the naive Apollinian artist, and he puts these very Apollinian words into Achilles that it's not, and that Nietzsche's trying to make us understand. You might be confused as a modern reader of these lines. What, isn't Achilles supposed to be a great hero? Shouldn't he be happy he died heroically? Well, no, Achilles would like to live another day, and he would do anything to live another day. He would even take a lowly, dishonorable position in life. And so Nietzsche addresses romanticism again in the next paragraph. He says, quote, "We should note that this harmony which is contemplated with such longing by modern man, in fact, this oneness of man with nature, for which Schiller introduced the technical term naive, is by no means a simple condition that comes into being naturally and as if inevitably. It is not a condition that, like a terrestrial paradise, must necessarily be found at the gate of every culture. Only a romantic age could believe this, an age which conceived of the artist in terms of Rousseau's Emile, and which imagined that in Homer it had found such an artist, Emile, reared at the bosom of nature. Where we encounter the naive in art, we should recognize the highest effect of Apollinian culture, which always must first overthrow an empire of titans and slay monsters, and which must have triumphed over an abysmal and terrifying view of the world, and the keenest susceptibility to suffering through recourse to the most forceful and pleasurable illusions, end quote. And so, it's interesting. It's as if Nietzsche is saying the idea of a terrestrial paradise and this return to nature as a sort of paradisiacal, like pre-civilizational utopia. He's like, yeah, only a romantic age really believes in that, because actually the reason why the Dionysian is so threatening is because the Apollinian like establishment of culture had to like overthrow titans and slay monsters. What does he mean by that? I mean, he means like you have to triumph over this abysmal and terrifying view of the world in order to establish these beautiful illusions, these artistic Olympian illusions that justify life. And he's again using that formula he talks about in the preface that is very useful to us here. They overcame this keenest susceptibility to suffering, because he says the Greeks are so singularly capable of suffering earlier because they're so sensitive and so vehement in their desires. And what he means there is like, we see the nobility do things that are excessively passionate or emotional to the modern mind when we look at them in some of their plays, like, the things that they're willing to do on the count of pride and, that would make no practical or logical sense, but in order to defend one's honor, doing things that lead to one's own death and the ruin of their whole nation, right? And so he interprets that as the Greeks being excessively sensitive. And so he's again looking at, okay, they created these beautiful, pleasurable illusions, which are the Olympian middle world of art. Why did they need such pleasurable illusions? Well, it must have, their intense sensitivity is what accounts for that. And so what he's saying here, they had to overcome an abysmal and terrifying view of the world in order to establish this Apollinian, quote-unquote, naive artist. Or rather, the naive early form of Apollinian art. And we can see from the example just given exactly what that is and what he's talking about. We had to overthrow the pessimism of Silenus, slay the monster of that sort of Dionysian pessimism in order to establish the Apollonian. And so I think what Nietzsche is getting at here is that the Dionysian, rather than being some sort of expression of our modern romanticism, which is not naive in an anthropological sense, but perhaps naive in quite a literal sense, right? Like just ignorant and foolish that we think that at the gate of culture, at the prelude to culture was this, natural harmony with nature where everything was all good and we, lived in harmony with the earth and we didn't have all this suffering and struggle that we have now. Nietzsche, in some sense, is suggesting that it's his reason for giving all these examples of these cultures like the Etruscans and the Babylonians and the Sacaeans that were overthrown and destroyed by the Dionysian art force, or whatever we want to call it, that at the gates of culture, there was actually this immense, what would you call it, like counterbalancing pressure, this immense pessimism, this immense desire for ecstatic rapture which is completely contrary to establishing all of the things that we think of that you need for civilization, establishing a law, establishing an order of differences between people, that like, yeah, this could be like a class system, but it's as simple as a division of labor, right? Establishing the differences between foreigner and countrymen, establishing, the very walls that guard the city and the rules that obtain within the city and outside of the city. And, the individuals ambition for personal glory that depends on his individual self-conception, which is separate from other people, and blah, 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 blah. All of that striving, that activity towards drawing up these boundaries, which are fictitious products of the human mind, that was always countered and overwhelmed whenever, at the dawn of civilization, as these city-states are rising up, they were always countered and overwhelmed by this Dionysian pessimism, you could say, which is the wisdom of Silenus, which negates all of the impetus for continuing that striving and that establishment of boundaries and hierarchy and the complexity of society. It was always overwhelmed by that. And so it's not, and Nietzsche portrays this as like a mix of sexuality and cruelty and violence and like just intoxicated, just complete giving way of all boundaries, and just it's completely destructive and utterly dangerous. He says there's nothing more dangerous than what the Apollinian, what the Gorgon's head that Apollo held out against the Dionysian impulses. There's nothing more dangerous than that. So it's not this like peaceful, idyllic, romantic beginning of culture. It's basically that the Apollonian had to overcome this pessimism, and it had to overcome Silenus and cut off his head. Okay, that's what it is. That the initial state of society is not this this primordial peace of the noble savage, right? Okay, so we'll finish up this section where Nietzsche says, quote, "The Homeric naivete can be understood only as the complete victory of Apollinian illusion. It is one of those illusions which nature so frequently employs to achieve her ends. The true goal is veiled by a phantasm, and while we stretch out our hands for the latter, nature attains the former by means of our illusion. In the Greeks, the will wished to contemplate itself in the transfiguration of genius and the world of art. In order to glorify themselves, its creatures had to feel themselves worthy of glory. They had to behold themselves again in a higher sphere. Without this perfect world of contemplation acting as a command or a reproach. This is the sphere of beauty, in which they saw their mirror images, the Olympians. With this mirroring of beauty, the Hellenic will combated its artistically correlative talent for suffering and for the wisdom of suffering. And as a monument of victory, we have Homer, the naive artist." End quote. So more or less summarizes what we've been saying. That again, notice the artist's metaphysics as Nietzsche talked about it, very clear in this last paragraph of section 3, that Nietzsche views all of these sort of the outgrowths of Greek culture and the Greeks themselves. He says in the Greeks, the will wished to contemplate itself, right? And he means that quite literally under the influence of Schopenhauer here, that all things are this great fundamental will, this undivided will, and therefore his language of talking about all phenomena in the world, it can always come back to that framing. And so that's what's going on there with a lot of the... Again, I would agree with Nietzsche insofar as the Schopenhauerian formulations do spoil the book to some extent, because they are the worst parts of the book insofar, and we're going to get into them next week with the next couple sections, where some of the language gets really tortured and contrived when he's talking about sort of these Schopenhauerian concepts. And it's almost difficult at times to understand even exactly what Nietzsche's saying. And I could see how it could be a roadblock to some people, because since Nietzsche moved on from these beliefs, sometimes you find yourself wondering, is it even important for me to figure out what he's saying in this like contrived, God, I need an Ariadne with a ball of yarn to like weave through this labyrinth of a paragraph, right? You will feel that way sometimes in Birth of Tragedy. But I think we've gotten the core concepts through of what the Apollinian is and what the Dionysian is in this first episode, episode in which we are, because we did the preface last time, but we're actually covering the meat of the text now. And he concludes more or less with showing us how Homer, the dramatic epic poet, he's an Apollinian artist, but how the Apollinian and the Dionysian, we're already getting a hint of it, sort of mutually reinforce and in a way, even though they're so opposed, contain one another or imply one another. That in order to represent the primordial pain and contradiction, the great suffering of the world, the great tragedy of the world by which man is apt to flee back into the arms of Mother Nature and no longer be an individual, striving, willing being anymore. In order to represent that, the Dionysian needs the Apollinian. And the Apollinian, furthermore, gains into its possession the weapons of the Dionysian as well. And by means of overcoming and slaying the monster of Silenus, by representing that titanic, what would you call it? The titanic, evil, monstrous rejection of the world as something that it can slay and contrapose the Olympians against, the Apollinian gains in power. It truly establishes itself as a culture by the slaying of monsters, and it assures its ascendancy. It is the victory of the Apollinian illusion, and that's where we get Homer. So we can already see how this narrative is going to go, where you have the Apollinian sort of sublating the Dionysian, and the Dionysian sublating the Apollinian in turn, and together producing more and more complex and subtle forms of artistic expression, which draw from both wells to more completely create this representation of the human existence. And so, all right, we're going to end it here. I'm going to try and go a little faster as we keep going, but in these first 3 sections, we are really getting across like all of the core concepts that are going to be important for the rest of the book. So especially in section 1, I felt it was important to really draw out a lot of those ideas. And so, yeah, we'll pick up again where we left off next week. Thanks, everyone. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or